Welcome back to Velmyst, UK. Tonight, we journey into medieval Britain, a land of kings, conquerors, and towering castles that still dominate the landscape today. Most of us have been taught that castles were built for one purpose: war, defense, protection against enemies. But what if that wasn't entirely true? What if the greatest purpose of Britain's castles had very little to do with keeping people out and everything to do with controlling the people within? What if castles were symbols, not merely of strength, but of fear, power, and authority? What if their enormous walls were designed not only to withstand sieges, but to remind ordinary people who ruled over them? Tonight, we uncover the hidden truth behind Britain's castles, a truth that historians have slowly pieced together over centuries, and one that changes the way we think about medieval Britain forever. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let us travel back nearly 1,000 years. When we imagine castles, we often picture knights defending walls against invading armies, and certainly many castles were capable of resisting attack. But warfare alone cannot explain why thousands of castles appeared across Britain after 1066. Something much larger was happening. Everything changed in the year 1066, when William, Duke of Normandy, crossed the English Channel and defeated King Harold at the Battle of Hastings. His victory transformed England forever, and one of the first things the Normans began building was castles. At first, these castles were simple wooden structures, known as motte and bailey castles. They could be built quickly, sometimes within days, and soon they began appearing throughout England. But these early castles were not always placed where enemies might attack. Instead, many were built beside towns, trade routes, and important centers of population, almost as though they were meant to watch over people rather than foreign invaders. To the ordinary villagers living nearby, these castles represented something new, something powerful, and perhaps something frightening, because above them stood the stone reminder that England now belonged to Norman rulers. Castles sent a message, not just to enemies, but to everyone. A message that power had changed hands, and that the king's authority could reach every corner of the land. Many historians now believe castles were political tools, physical symbols of conquest, visible reminders of who ruled and who obeyed. In many ways, architecture itself became a weapon. And perhaps the greatest surprise of all is that many castles never experienced a major battle. Some stood for centuries without ever facing a siege, which raises an important question. If they were built for defense, why were they so rarely used for war? The deeper historians looked into Britain's castles, the stranger the story became, because behind their walls lay a world of wealth, status, politics, and power, a world far removed from the battlefield. And that is where our journey continues. After his victory in 1066, William the Conqueror faced a difficult challenge. He had conquered England, but he had not yet secured it. Millions of Anglo-Saxons now lived under a foreign ruler, and rebellion was always possible. William needed something more powerful than armies. He needed control. His solution was surprisingly simple: build castles, and build them quickly. Within years, hundreds of fortifications began appearing across England, not at distant borders, but deep inside towns and populated areas. To ordinary people, these structures were unlike anything they had ever seen. Towering wooden walls, deep ditches, and armed Norman soldiers standing above them. Every castle sent the same message: England now belonged to its conquerors. Many castles overlooked markets, roads, rivers, and centers of trade. These were not random choices. Whoever controlled these places controlled wealth itself. Castles also allowed Norman lords to monitor local populations. From behind their walls, they could collect taxes, enforce laws, and quickly suppress rebellion. Their presence was a constant reminder of royal authority. Fear played an important role. The sight of a castle rising above a village was meant to impress and perhaps intimidate. These massive structures represented power in stone. Even London was transformed. One of William's greatest projects became the Tower of London, not simply a fortress, but but a symbol, a visible statement that Norman rule had arrived and intended to stay. Over time, wooden castles gave way to stone keeps. These were more expensive, more impressive, and more permanent. They proclaimed wealth as much as military strength. Historians now believe castles were carefully designed to inspire obedience, not just through violence, but through appearance. Architecture itself became part of political control, and as the centuries passed, Britain's castles became something even more extraordinary, because increasingly, they began to serve another purpose entirely, a purpose connected not to war, but to wealth, luxury, and status. And that is where our journey continues. As decades passed, castles began to change. The threat of invasion had not disappeared, but many noble families were thinking about something else: prestige, status, and displaying their wealth to the world. For powerful lords, a castle was no longer simply a fortress, it was a statement. The larger and more impressive the castle, the more powerful its owner appeared. Stone walls, towering keeps, and grand entrances were designed to leave visitors in awe. Every detail communicated authority. Inside these walls, life was often far more luxurious than people imagine. Rich tapestries covered stone walls. Fireplaces provided warmth, and elaborate decorations transformed cold fortresses into elegant homes. At the heart of many castles stood the Great Hall. This was where nobles entertained guests, held feasts, and displayed their wealth and importance. Politics and celebrations often happened under the same roof. Royal visits became major events. When kings traveled across Britain, castles competed to host them. Owners spent huge fortunes preparing lavish banquets and impressive ceremonies, because pleasing the king could bring wealth and influence. Some castles included beautiful gardens, private chapels, and comfortable living quarters, features that offered little military advantage, but they revealed something important. Comfort and prestige had become just as important as defense. Many windows became larger, rooms became brighter, and architects focused increasingly on beauty rather than warfare, because these castles were meant to impress friends and rivals alike. Perhaps the greatest irony is that some castles were never truly designed to withstand serious attack. Their owners assumed peace would continue, and appearance mattered more than survival. Visitors entering these castles were meant to feel small. The vast halls, the towering walls, and the symbols of wealth everywhere they looked. Everything was carefully designed to inspire admiration and obedience. By now, castles had become something entirely different. Not merely fortresses, not simply homes, but symbols of power, prestige, and status. Yet another surprising chapter remained, because eventually many castles became almost completely useless for war, and still people continued building them. Why? That is where our journey continues. For centuries, castles had dominated Britain's landscape. Their walls appeared unstoppable, their towers seemed eternal. But history was changing, and a new invention was about to transform warfare forever: gunpowder.
Cannons made many traditional castle walls vulnerable. What had once taken months to destroy could now be damaged in days. Suddenly, centuries of military architecture faced a dangerous new reality. By the 15th century, castles were becoming less effective as fortresses. Military engineers began designing new types of defenses: lower walls, stronger earthworks, and structures better suited to the age of gunpowder. Yet something curious happened. People continued building castles, not because they expected war, but because castles had become symbols of prestige. To own a great castle was to announce wealth and status. The age of the fortress slowly gave way to the age of the palace. Comfort became increasingly important. Large windows, beautiful gardens. Luxurious chambers and grand staircases replaced many purely defensive features. Some castles became centers of politics and diplomacy. Kings entertained foreign visitors, nobles arranged marriages, and powerful families displayed their influence. The walls protected reputations more than armies. In time, many castles were abandoned. Others fell into ruin, and and some were transformed into elegant country homes. Their military purpose faded, but their symbolic power remained. Even today, Britain's castles continue attracting millions of visitors, not because people fear invasion, but because these buildings still inspire wonder. They connect us to a world long gone. Historians now understand that castles were never simply machines of war. They were homes, political tools, status symbols, and monuments to power. Their story is far more complex than we once believed, and perhaps the greatest surprise of all is this. Many of Britain's most famous castles survived not because they were perfect fortresses, but because they represented something greater: power, authority, and the dreams of those who built them. And that brings us to the final chapter of our journey. Today, historians view castles very differently from how people once imagined them. They were never simply fortresses built for endless war. Instead, they served many purposes: homes, symbols, political centers, and statements of power. For medieval nobles, castles represented success. A castle demonstrated wealth, prestige, and influence. Long before social media or newspapers, architecture itself announced who held power. Castles also shaped communities around them. Markets grew nearby, villages expanded, tradesmen found work, and local economies developed around these great structures. Some castles became centers of justice, others hosted kings and queens, and many became places where important decisions shaped Britain's future. Behind their walls, history unfolded. Yet perhaps the greatest power castles possessed was psychological. They inspired fear, respect, and admiration. Their presence alone reminded people who ruled the land. Centuries passed, kings changed, wars ended, and many castles slowly fell into ruin. But even broken walls still carried stories. Stories of ambition, power, and human dreams. Today, millions visit Britain's castles every year, not because they expect battle, but because these places connect us to another age, an age of knights, kings, queens, and forgotten lives. The truth about castles is far more fascinating than the myths. They were never only about defense. They were about identity, authority, status, and the desire to leave something behind that would outlive generations. Perhaps that is why castles continue to capture our imagination. Because they remind us that history is rarely simple, and that behind every stone lies another story waiting to be discovered.
As we come to the end of tonight's journey, remember this: Britain's castles were never simply built to keep enemies out. They were built to show power, to inspire loyalty, to display wealth, and above all, to shape the world around them. And nearly 1,000 years later, thank you for joining us on velmyst UK. If you enjoy relaxing journeys through British history, forgotten mysteries, and fascinating true stories, please subscribe and join us again for our next documentary.